In the summer of 2019, every beekeeper in Lanark County, Ontario, ran their hives the same way. This was not a trend. It was the natural order of things, the way the Mississippi River runs south. The county had been keeping bees since the early settlers cleared the limestone ridges above Perth, and for most of that time, the work had been done by instinct and observation, and the accumulated knowledge of people who spent their summers in veils and leather gloves reading colonies the way a doctor reads a patient. But by 2019, that era had largely ended. The monitoring technology that had come into the industry over the previous decade had changed the conversation about what serious beekeeping looked like, and Lanark County's commercial operations had changed with it. Let me tell you about what happened in August of that year, because it is the reason this story exists. And it is the reason that one apiary in Lanark County produces honey that looks different from every other honey in the county today. Varroa mite. If you keep bees, those two words land the way a diagnosis lands. Varroa destructor is a parasitic mite that reproduces inside honeybee brood cells, feeding on developing pupae, weakening the adult bees that emerge, and spreading a suite of viruses through a colony the way a slow leak spreads through a dam. Left unmanaged, a Varroa infestation will collapse a hive within 2 to 3 years. Managed incorrectly with the wrong treatment at the wrong time, you can kill your queens, sterilize your brood, and contaminate the honey crop you spent all summer building. There is no casual relationship with Varroa. You are either managing it deliberately or you are losing colonies, and the only question is how fast. By 2019, the standard of care for commercial operations in Ontario had migrated toward electronic hive monitoring. Load cells under the hive floor measured daily weight change, which told you about nectar flow and winter starvation. Temperature sensors inside the brood cluster told you whether the colony was contracting or expanding. Acoustic monitors listened for the frequency signature of a queenless hive, a subtle, unmistakable vibration that experienced beekeepers once learned to hear by pressing an ear to the wood. Mite. Wash data fed into management apps that calculated infestation rates and generated treatment calendars. The Bee-Informed Partnership had published the research. The Provincial Apiarist's Office had issued the recommendations. Every supplier at the Eastern Ontario Beekeepers Association annual meeting in Carleton Place had been selling the integrated approach for 3 years running. The operations that had adopted the technology swore by it. They could monitor 40 hives from a single dashboard. They could catch a weight drop that indicated robbing behavior before it wiped out a weak colony. They could flag a temperature anomaly in January without driving out on frozen roads. The systems had made large-scale beekeeping in Ontario more precise, more data-driven, and, by the metrics that mattered to lenders and processors, more professional. On the third weekend of August 2019, the cellular data network that served the eastern edge of Lanark County dropped service for 61 hours following a lightning strike on a transmission tower outside Smiths Falls. The hive monitors across the county went dark. Not the hives, the monitors. The bees didn't notice, but the beekeepers did, and they noticed in the specific way that people notice when the instrument they rely on to tell them what is happening has stopped telling them anything. The problem was the timing. August in Ontario is when Varroa mite populations peak. The mites reproduce through the brood cycle, and by late summer, after 3 months of exponential reproduction, a colony that was manageable in June can be dangerously infested in August. The monitoring apps calculated this. They generated alerts. They pushed notifications to phones. But without the cellular connection, the sensors were silent. And without the sensor data, the management apps had nothing to calculate. The treatment windows that the system had been tracking, The precise research-backed intervals that the commercial operations had built their August schedules around were now invisible. Some beekeepers drove out to their yards and tried to do visual mite washes by hand. A mite wash is not complicated in principle. You take a sample of approximately 300 bees from the brood nest, wash them in alcohol or powdered sugar, and count the mites that fall out. You divide by the number of bees in your sample. You get a percentage. If it's above 2% in August, you treat. If it's below, you wait. The principle is straightforward. The execution, in a yard of 40 hives in the August heat, with gloves on and bees in the air, and the particular focused attention required to pull a frame, find a capped brood patch, and count bees into a jar without losing count or getting stung on the wrist. That is something you have to have done many times before it becomes reliable. Most of the county's commercial keepers had not done a manual mite wash in 2 or 3 years. The monitors did it for them, continuously, passively, without requiring anyone to put on a veil at 2 in the afternoon in August. When they went out to their yards that weekend and tried to work without the data, the gaps in their hands-on knowledge showed. One operation near Balderson, running 26 hives, decided to treat prophylactically with oxalic acid rather than wait for the network to come back. Oxalic acid is an effective miticide, but it only works on mites in the phoretic stage, mites riding on adult bees. It does not penetrate capped brood. Applied during a heavy brood cycle, it kills the mites it can reach and leaves the ones it cannot. And if your infestation rate is already high, you have now committed to a treatment that will not do the job while your colony continues to decline. 2 of that operation's strongest hives were in peak brood when the treatment went in. The keeper did not know that. He had been reading the data, not the brood. Another operation, south of Perth, waited out the network outage entirely, reasoning that 61 hours without data was preferable to making a treatment decision without information. That was a defensible choice. But August does not wait, and the 2 hives in that yard that were sitting at a 2.4% infestation rate on Thursday morning were sitting closer to 3% by Sunday afternoon, which is the difference between a manageable situation and a collapsing one in a drought year when the bees are already under stress. Let me tell you about Audrey Cote, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she did that August weekend. Audrey was 53 years old in the summer of 2019 and had kept bees on the same 40 acres her grandparents had farmed outside the village of McDonald's Corners in the north end of Lanark County since she was old enough to carry a smoker. Her grandfather, Gus Cote, had come to that land in 1961 with a woodworking trade, a vegetable garden, and 3 Langstroth hives he had bought from a retiring beekeeper in Renfrew. He kept bees because the orchard needed pollination and because he found them interesting, which is the reason most people start and the reason very few of them stop. Her mother, Denise, had taken over the hives in the 1980s, expanding to 12 colonies and selling varietal honey at the Perth Farmers Market every Saturday from May to October. Audrey had grown up in those hives, literally. Her earliest clear memory was standing beside her grandfather in the apiary, holding a frame in both hands at an age when the frame was almost as wide as she was tall, watching him point to the cells where the eggs lay, teaching her to see what was there before he taught her what it meant. Audrey had never left McDonald's Corners. She had studied agricultural science at the University of Guelph, graduated in 1989, spent 4 years working for a provincial pollination contractor in the Niagara region, and come home in 1993 when her mother's arthritis made the heavy lifting of the honey harvest difficult. She had run the apiary since then. 22 hives currently, down from a high of 31 in 2011, before a bad nosema year reduced the operation to what she could manage alone. She sold honey wholesale to 3 retailers in Perth and 1 in Carlton Place, and she sold beeswax to a candle maker in Kingston who had been buying from her since 2001. Audrey was not opposed to technology. She had read the research on Hive monitoring systems. She had attended the sessions at the Eastern Ontario meetings. She had looked at the costs, the sensors, the subscription fees, the router equipment required to push data from a rural apiary on a rocky lot with marginal cellular coverage, and she had decided that the coverage at McDonald's Corners was too unreliable to justify a system that depended on it. She had said so to the provincial apiarist who had visited her yard in 2017 for a routine inspection. He had nodded, made a note, and moved on. The decision was not dramatic. It was practical. A system that only works when the network cooperates is not a system designed for the north end of Lanark County. What Audrey used instead was the thing she had been using since her grandfather taught her to look before he taught her to understand. She used her eyes. Let me explain what that means, because most people who did not grow up in an apiary do not know what a beekeeper actually sees when she opens a hive. And the seeing is the reason this story goes the way it does. A mite wash gives you a number. The number tells you where you are relative to a threshold. That is useful. It is quantitative, reproducible, defensible to a crop insurance adjuster. But the number tells you nothing that the frame itself does not tell you if you know how to read it. A capped brood frame with a high mite load shows you sunken cappings, scattered pattern, cells that have been recapped irregularly. The brood is telling you it is under stress before the mite count gets high enough to generate an alert. A colony in decline from varroa-vectored virus load changes its cluster behavior, its flight pattern, its entrance activity in ways that are visible, that are there to be read, before the data catches up to what is happening. The bees are communicating continuously. You just have to be present enough to hear them. Audrey had been reading those signals for 30 years. She made her rounds every 7 to 10 days through the active season, pulling frames, reading brood, watching flight patterns at the entrance, noting the weight of the honey super in her hands when she lifted it, the sound of the colony when she walked past without opening anything. She kept a paper notebook with records going back to 2004. 1 page per hive per season, written in the compact shorthand she had developed over years. She did not need a sensor to tell her what was happening in her apiary because she had been inside it often enough to know. On Saturday morning of the network outage, Audrey Cote pulled on her veil at 7 o'clock, lit her smoker with newspaper and dried sumac leaves the way her grandfather had taught her, and walked to her apiary the way she did every week. She did not know the network was down. She would not learn about it until her neighbor Terrence Wheatley mentioned it when he stopped by that evening on his way back from town. She opened each of her 22 hives in order, working from south to north the way she always did, pulling frames, reading the brood, making her marks in the notebook. She found 2 hives showing the early signs of elevated varroa pressure, sunken cappings in the upper brood box, a scatter pattern that was not yet alarming, but was moving in a direction she recognized. She did a manual mite wash on each of those 2 colonies. Both came in at 1.8%, not at the treatment threshold yet, but close enough that she flagged them for a follow-up inspection in 5 days, and began calculating whether her treatment window, if she needed one, could be timed to coincide with a natural brood break she had been watching develop in the stronger of the 2 colonies. She did not treat that Saturday. She did not need to. She had enough information from the frame itself and the wash numbers to know what was happening and what she needed to watch for. She closed the hives, made her notes, and was back inside by 10:30. Let me tell you about what happened at the Eastern Ontario Beekeepers Association meeting in Carleton Place the following February, because that is where the other part of this story lives. The association held its winter meetings in the back room of an agricultural supply store on the edge of town. Folding chairs arranged around long tables, coffee in a percolator that the store owner had been running since the association started meeting there in the late 1990s. It was the place where the county's beekeepers gathered in the off-season to compare notes, argue about feed formulations, and talk about the losses from the previous year with the particular directness of people who measure their winter in dead colonies. The August network outage had become a known event in the local beekeeping community by February. 2 operations had reported colony losses that they attributed at least partly to the treatment errors made during the outage window. The Balderson operation had lost one of the 2 hives treated during the brood cycle. The South Perth operation had lost 1 colony entirely and seen a second requeen itself in September, which pointed to a queen failure that likely traced back to the late summer mite pressure that had gone unmanaged through the outage. A man named Stuart Galbraith was running the discussion that evening. Stuart was the equipment sales representative for a precision apiculture supplier based in Ottawa, 48 years old, with the particular fluency about monitoring technology that comes from having sold it for 6 years to people who were initially skeptical and subsequently convinced. He had sold monitoring equipment to 4 operations in Lanark County, including the one in Balderson. He was at the meeting that February because 2 of his customers had called him after the August outage, and he had driven out to help them assess the situation, and he had been thinking about what had happened ever since. He was explaining the cellular redundancy options now available from his supplier, a satellite uplink module that could maintain data transmission in areas with unreliable cellular coverage, priced at around $800 per apiary. He said the August outage was an anomaly, but that the satellite option essentially made it a non-issue going forward. He said it with the measured confidence of a man who has a product that addresses a problem that has recently become very visible to his customers. It was Thomas Riddell who mentioned Audrey Cote. Thomas kept 14 hives near Lanark Village and had known Audrey for 20 years through the association. He brought it up the way you mention something that seems relevant once you've said it out loud. He said that Audrey had gone through the entire outage weekend without any monitoring equipment and had come out of it with full colony health assessments on all 22 hives and no treatment errors because she had been doing manual inspections on a regular schedule and had simply continued doing what she always did. The room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms are quiet when someone has said something that does not quite fit the conversation that was happening before they said it. Stuart Galbraith smiled. It was not an unkind smile. It was the smile of a man who has had a long and mostly successful career explaining why the traditional approach has limitations, and who finds the suggestion that the traditional approach might have handled the recent problem better than the modern one to be interesting, in the way that a chess player finds an unexpected move interesting, worth considering, but ultimately not changing the analysis. Manual inspection is excellent, he said. Audrey is an exceptional beekeeper. 30 years of experience, that's real. But manual inspection is also operator-dependent, time-intensive, and not scalable. If you're running 40 hives, you cannot inspect every frame every 7 days. He looked around the room for acknowledgement. Several people nodded. The monitoring system gives you continuous data across your whole operation, 24 hours a day, no veil required. Have you ever watched someone defend a system by changing the question? Stewart had not argued that the system worked better than Audrey's method during the outage. He had argued that her method didn't scale. That was true. It also wasn't the question on the table, which was about what happened when the system failed. Audrey was in the room. She was sitting near the back with her notebook open on her lap, the same spiral-bound kind she had been using for 15 years, and she had written 2 lines in it since Stewart started talking. She did not say anything when Thomas mentioned her name. She waited. After the meeting, in the parking lot, Stewart approached her. He was direct about it, which she respected. He said he had heard about her August inspections and asked how she had managed to keep her mite assessments current without electronic support. She said she had done them the same way she had done them for 29 years. Regular inspection schedule, frame, reading, manual wash. When the visual indicators suggested it was time, he asked what visual indicators she relied on. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come to the yard in May and I'll show you." He came. He stood beside her at the first hive she opened, and she talked through what she was looking at. The cap surface texture, the brood pattern, the way the nurse bees were clustering on the frame, the size and posture of the workers she was pulling into the sun to look at their abdomens. She opened 4 hives. By the 4th one, Stewart was not watching the frame. He was watching her eyes, the way they moved across the comb, the speed and sequence of what she was reading. At the end of the inspection, he said, "You're doing the same thing the sensor does. You're just doing it with 30 years of pattern recognition instead of an algorithm." She said, "The difference is that my pattern recognition works when the network goes down." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I bring a customer out here sometime? Someone who's just starting with the technology. I think there's something they should see." She said yes. Let me tell you about the summer of 2020, because the story does not end in the parking lot in Carlton Place. The COVID spring of 2020 disrupted the supply chains for monitoring equipment across eastern Ontario. Replacement sensors were back-ordered. Subscription service techs were unavailable. Several operations that had built their entire Varroa management strategy around the monitoring dashboard found themselves in the position of having equipment that was partially functional. With components they couldn't replace, going into a season where Varroa pressure was higher than normal because the 2019 losses had disrupted the regional mite management continuity. Audrey's 22 hives went into 2020 with the same equipment they had always used: a smoker, a hive tool, a veil, a notebook, and 30 years of knowing what to look for. She finished the 2020 season with 20 hives producing, which was better than the county average that year. Her Varroa management had not been disrupted by back-ordered sensors or unavailable service contacts because it did not depend on sensors or service contacts. The numbers got around. They get around in small agricultural counties where people know which operations are performing and which are struggling, and where the winter conversations at the association meetings are honest, in the way that conversations are honest when everyone in the room is dealing with the same hard year. Let me tell you about the afternoon in October 2021 when Stuart Galbraith drove out to McDonald's Corners not to sell anything, because that moment matters. Audrey was in the barn doing her post-season colony assessments, going through her notebook and transferring the season's data into the ledger she had kept since 1994. Stuart stood in the barn door for a minute before she noticed him. When she did, she set down her pen and waited. He said he had been thinking about the conversation from the parking lot in Carlton Place. He said that in the 18 months since then, he had started talking to his customers differently. He still sold monitoring equipment. He still believed in it. But he had started asking his customers a question before he sold them a system. "Can you read a brood frame?" And if the answer was no, he started there. He brought them to Audrey when she agreed to it, which was not always. He had sent 4 customers to her in the past year. She had spent an afternoon with each of them in the apiary. She said, "Sit down." He sat on an overturned crate near the barn door. She sat across from him on a wooden stool that had been in the barn since her grandfather's time. "The system you sell is a good system," she said. "Continuous monitoring across 40 hives is real." "I'm not arguing that." She paused. "But the system tells you when something is wrong. It doesn't tell you how to look at the thing that is wrong and understand what it needs. Those are 2 different skills." Stewart said, "The February meeting cost my customers 2 colonies and 1 requeening." She said, "I know. Thomas told me, how do you teach someone to read a brood frame the way you do?" he asked. It was a genuine question, the kind that surfaces after the professional defensiveness has worn down. She stood up and walked him to the nearest hive box, which was sitting on a bench against the barn wall. It was empty, post-season, but she had left a brood frame in it for reference. She pulled the frame and held it in the October light coming through the barn door. "You learn the healthy pattern first," she said. "Solid cappings, consistent color, no sunken cells, no scattered empty spaces in the middle of a brood patch. You memorize what that looks like. Then you look at everything else as a deviation from that standard." She turned the frame slowly. "A mite problem doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. You're looking for the beginning of a pattern, not the end of one." She held the frame out to him, and he took it. He stood there for a minute looking at it the way someone looks at something they have never looked at closely before. Then he said, "The sensor flags the end of the pattern." "Yes," she said, "and by then you're already behind." He drove back to Ottawa that afternoon with a specific understanding he had not had when he drove out, that the data his systems generated was a trailing indicator. It told you where a colony had been. The frame told you where it was going. He did not stop selling monitoring systems. He continued believing in them. But he added something to his customer consultations after that fall. A conversation about what to do with the information the system generated, which required knowing how to read a brood frame, which required learning from someone who had done it long enough that it had become fluent. Let me tell you about what happened at the association's winter meeting in 2022, because the story does not end in Audrey's barn. The provincial apiarist that year was a woman named Sandra Prue, who had been covering eastern Ontario for 7 years and had watched the precision monitoring adoption curve with the careful attention of someone responsible for colony health across the region. Sandra had been correlating the 2019 and 2020 loss data, and she had noticed something in the pattern. Operations with high monitoring adoption but low hands-on inspection frequency had not outperformed operations with consistent manual inspection practices. In drought-stress years, they had slightly underperformed. She put that finding in a provincial newsletter that went to registered beekeeping operations across Ontario. She did not name Audrey Cote. She did not mention McDonald's Corners or the August 2019 outage. She simply noted that the research on colony monitoring systems consistently showed best results when combined with regular hands-on inspection, and that operations which had substituted monitoring for inspection, rather than supplementing inspection with monitoring, had shown higher variance in outcomes during equipment or network disruption events. Audrey read the newsletter at her kitchen table in January. She set it down and poured herself a second cup of coffee and did not say anything about it to anyone. But 5 beekeepers in Lanark County called the provincial office that winter asking about manual inspection practices. Sandra Prue referred 2 of them to Audrey Cote. One of those 2 was a young woman named Priya Weston, 29 years old, who had started beekeeping 4 years earlier and had built her operation of 16 hives entirely around the monitoring technology because that was the standard when she began, and she had never been taught anything else. She drove out to McDonald's Corners on a Saturday in February, when the snow was still a foot deep in the yard and the hives were wrapped in black tar paper for the winter, and spent 3 hours in the barn, while Audrey showed her the record notebooks and talked her through what a frame inspection revealed at each stage of the season. Priya asked more questions than Audrey expected. She asked about the specific visual markers for varroa stress, about how to distinguish a queenless cluster sound from a queen-right one, about how often you could open a hive in cold weather without disrupting the winter cluster. At the end of the afternoon, she asked if she could come back in April and watch Audrey do the first spring inspection. Audrey said yes. Let me tell you about the spring of 2022, because it is where the story turns forward. Priya came out to McDonald's Corners on the first warm morning of the season, when the maples were budding and the bees were making cleansed flights for the first time since November. She stood at the end of the hive row and watched Audrey open the first 6 colonies of the spring assessment. She watched the way Audrey's hands moved on the frames, unhurried, deliberate, reading each one before she set it down. She watched Audrey pause at the 3rd hive and spend an extra 90 seconds with one particular frame, tilting it in the light, running a gloved finger slowly along a row of cappings. She watched Audrey close that hive and make a note in the spiral book before moving to the next one. After the 6th hive, Priya asked what Audrey had seen in the 3rd one. Audrey described it: 2 cells with irregular recapping in the upper brood box, a visual indicator worth watching but not yet actionable. She showed Priya the notation she had made. She explained how she would track that hive over the next 2 inspections to determine whether the pattern was stabilizing or progressing. Priya went home that afternoon and ordered a spiral notebook. She kept her monitoring system. She was not Audrey, and she had no intention of being Audrey, who had 30 years of pattern recognition that could not be transferred in an afternoon. But she understood now that the monitor was reading a signal that originated in the frame, and that if she could read the frame, she would be ahead of the signal. She began inspecting every 10 days through the active season, pulling frames, writing in her notebook, learning to see what was there before she was told what to look for. In August of 2022, a firmware update to her monitoring system's hub unit corrupted the temperature calibration and produced a series of false alerts that her management app flagged as potential queenlessness in 4 hives. She stood in her yard looking at her phone for a long minute, and then she put the phone in her pocket, lit her smoker, and opened the hives herself. All 4 colonies were queen-right, with normal late-summer cluster behavior. She closed the hives, made her notes, and called the tech support line to report the firmware issue. She did not panic. She knew what she was looking at. Audrey Cote is 57 years old now and still runs 22 hives on the 40 acres outside McDonald's Corners. She still makes her rounds every 7 to 10 days through the active season, still lights her smoker with newspaper and dried sumac leaves, still writes in the spiral notebook. Her honey still goes to the 3 retailers in Perth and the candle maker in Kingston. Stuart Galbraith now includes a 2-page insert in every monitoring system he sells in Eastern Ontario, a visual guide to manual brood frame inspection that he developed in consultation with Audrey over the winter of 2021. He asked her permission before he printed it. She said yes, on the condition that it told people to find an experienced beekeeper and learn in person, because a diagram was not the same as standing beside someone who knew what they were looking at. The insert says exactly that. Priya Weston's 16 hives are now 20. She uses her monitoring system every day of the active season and trusts it because she understands what it is measuring and can verify what it tells her. Her inspection notebooks go back 4 years now. She has started to see patterns that she did not notice in the first 2 years, the subtle early indicators that accumulate before the data catches up. Last spring, Priya brought a friend from her beekeeping club, a man who had just bought his first hive and his first monitoring system in the same week, out to McDonald's Corners. Audrey opened 6 hives for them. At the 5th one, she paused and handed the frame to the new beekeeper without saying anything. He held it, turned it in the light the way he had watched Audrey do it, and looked at the comb for a long moment. He said, "I don't know what I'm looking for yet." Audrey said, "That's exactly right. That's where you start." The network outage in August 2019 went dark for 61 hours across the north end of Lanark County. Every hive monitor in the region stopped transmitting. One beekeeper who had never installed a sensor finished her inspection rounds on schedule and wrote up her assessments in a spiral notebook before the network came back online. Her colonies came through that August intact. Some knowledge doesn't become obsolete. It goes quiet for a while, waiting for the moment when the signal drops, and the only thing left is whether someone in the yard still knows how to read what the bees are saying.